Hello, and welcome to this next session for CKA exam mock exams. So today we're basically going to run through mock exam number one from Code Cloud. And really what we're going to do is we're going to concentrate on going to our Series 2 Kubernetes CKA exam here and our file here entitled mock exams number one. So if I open that um, file here, you can basically sort of see that, like with the Lightning Lab previously, I've created all of the actual commands that are required for this exam to be run through. So the point is that, you know, try and get familiar with the commands, try and get faster with the commands. And as you basically build up your speed and your knowledge of the actual commands themselves, you hopefully can, apply them to the exam to complete the exam really on time when in the real scenario. So the other thing I'd just like to kind of point out here is that, you know, what I need to do here is I've obviously registered for Code Cloud here, and if I click on Start Lab, I'm going to the mock exam number one here because I'm basically in my CKA course here, and I'm going to my mock exam number one, and I'm going to click on Start Lab, and in a second I'm basically going to get this lab environment up that allows me to practice these questions. Now, it kind of carries over from what we did in the Lightning Lab. So we're going to do the same type of scenario here that, we're going to use Chat GPT to see how the actual responses are regarding the new set of questions here for the mock exam. So I'm just going to create a new chat here. And again, if you haven't seen the Lightning um, previous session, maybe have a look back in that. But essentially, ChatGPT, it's part of OpenAI, and it's going to be what we're going to refer to as a type of study buddy. So maybe the kind of first time that you run through the actual mock exams, you may have to, do them a little bit kind of slower just to make sure that you'd actually understand all of the theory that's been applied. And then, over the time with the mock exams, I hear some people, they practice these mock exams and the lightning type questions, 7, 8 times before they actually get to the exam. So, you know, make sure that you do actually practice these a number of times. And you can also sort of see that we actually have a clock that's ticking down, plus a number of questions here, 12, and they all have different weights. So let's kind of get into the first question here. So it says deploy a pod named dat using that image. Once done, click on the next question. Okay, so basically this is quite an easy one. And what we were referring to as well was don't spend time in the exam, specifically naming these out. Make sure that you shave some time off of where you basically can. So what I'm basically going to do here is I'm going to create my pod here. Now, if I was actually in the exam, just make sure that you kind of copy and paste into the actual terminal here, also to kind of save yourself some time. Don't individually um, be typing out too much here. So you can sort of see that the pod is actually running. So this is kind of question one, and we'll kind of move on to the second question. Now, in the second question, it says deploy a messaging app using that image with the labels that, and so it's here is equal to message. Now, it's quite an easy mock exam, this one, and they do kind of get harder, but the theory is really just to kind of get your mind thinking into this kind of scenario where you basically have a number of questions and a time, and it's really kind of about how fast you can actually complete them. So you can sort of say here, you can sort of see I've actually got a get pod, and if I do ls tier is equal to message, you can sort of see here, I can actually sort of see that I actually have one pod with that label. So what I'm going to do here is I'm also going to just go back in here, and I'm going to just add that because I feel that's kind of, um, more important really than the actual get pods command here. So I'm just going to save that. Because like you, I mean, I'm working also through the exam itself. So let's kind of move on to question 3, where we sort of says create a namespace named that. Now again, this is quite easy. Um, Really, what you need to be doing is, learn the simple commands like creating a namespace, getting pods, creating pods, using the imperative approach here, um, plus how to actually output them to file. Anything like that that can basically save you time, because you know we know that we basically have the documentation here, but really we want to make sure that with the documentation it's for more advanced maybe kind of subjects or theories that you'd actually require it for. So the simple things maybe you may be able to kind of learn yourself. So let's move on to um, question 4, where we basically say get a list of nodes in JSON format and store it into a file called that. So really, you can get your nodes um, like so with the output to JSON. And you can sort of see this, and it doesn't sort of say, in this case, it doesn't mention about custom columns or, format the columns or specifically take out certain information like one of the examples we saw in the Lightning Lab. So it just says get a list of nodes in JSON format and then store it to that file. So really, it's kind of just moving on from the kind of the command that we just ran a second ago to running this type of kind of file here. And really what I can kind of do is I can kind of just kind of output my file here, and you can basically sort of see that everything is actually out as it should be. So let me just actually copy that, and let me just add that also into our get notes, because that's also nice to actually have. I'm going to save that. And I mean, you know, these are also my personal notes, that I'm actually using for the exam. So I mean, um, it's not that um, I'm never going to update these notes, because I like to kind of maintain them, and as I find little items that I'd like to actually change, I do update the notes, because I feel it's important to kind of keep the notes good, so that you know you also improve with me as well. So question 5 here, so this says create a service called that and expose the messaging application with the cluster on port that use imperative commands. So, there's some information here. So really what it says is create a service and expose it, and expose the messaging application on the port that. So really what I want to kind of do here is, I know that basically probably already I actually have a messaging um, application that's already running. So I mean, if I sort of say expose pod messaging with the name and the port and the target port, you can sort of see that the messaging service has actually been exposed here, and I can describe my service here, and you can see that it's a cluster IP, and there's an IP here, but really the kind of target port is actually here as well. And I can sort of say get wide my pods here, and you can sort of see, I actually have the messaging app here that's got basically one pod, and it's in a running state. So, I mean, it like we sort of said in the Lightning, it depends on how much you actually really, want to spend, um, going through and verifying the actual information. It definitely does help, through the exam, to kind of verify that some items are actually there. And then it does actually kind of help to, depending on your time, you know, you don't have time to maybe kind of verify every single instance of what the actual question sort of says. So just make sure that, you kind of pick and choose, and maybe the kind of simpler ones you just kind of go ahead with, because you could definitely use that time for something else. But you know, if I sort of said here, if I went into my ChatGPT and I sort of said, well, imagine I sort of said, well, I'm not really sure how I could actually do that. So if I sort of said expose application here, let me just refresh this, get back into a new session here, so I can sort of say kube, that is expose application on cluster IP. Let's just sort of see what it actually sort of says to me. In Kubernetes, you can expose an application running inside a cluster with a service with type cluster IP. Here's how to do it. Create a deployment. So we knew that the deployment was there. Create a service. Expose it on that. Create that. You can sort of see in it sort of says really nicely. In this example, the service will listen on port 80 and forward traffic to the application running on port 8080. So in this case, the target port is actually inside on the pod itself. So you can nearly kind of think of the exposed port, which would basically be really into the actual browser, but this is the target port on the actual node itself, and you can sort of see that that's the actual name of your service here. But technically, it's really the kind of same steps that we would have actually performed, except for the deployment already had existed. So really positive little test there. So let's move on to kind of question 6 then. And it says create a deployment named that using that with 2 replicas. So again, this is where we sort of say, okay, so we want to make sure that we have, let's just clear the screen here, clear for more real estate. So this is where we sort of say, create a deployment. So this time it says create a deployment named that using that image with 2 replicas. Now the first thing we'd actually have to do is actually create the actual deployment itself. Then what we'd like to do is, which is the kind of common method, is also that then we would actually scale the actual application here. And then you can sort of say, well, let's get our deployment here. And you can sort of see that, from this actual deployment, you actually have 2 pods that are actually up and available about 19 seconds. So there is 2 replicas or 2 pods that's already actually running. And this, during the exam scenario, really what you're trying to do is you're trying to watch the clock and you're trying to watch the weights. So every question will basically have a weighting, and you're just trying to make sure that if it's a really small weighting, and it took a really long time, it may be worth leaving till the end. And then if you were not to complete that question, it wouldn't have the biggest impact on your score. But if you feel that you get to kind of a question that is worth the actual effort, that's a big weight, then certainly it could be time. And again, everybody, they may kind of tackle the kind of questions themselves, but they do kind of recommend that that you kind of try and tackle the easy ones first. And a lot of these questions that we've kind of come up against, like the first 6 here, they've definitely been kind of quite easy. And if they kind of came up in exams, you would kind of think that it's probably going to be kind of easier points to bank. So let's find we're going to look at now at question 7, and question 7 has a weight of 8. So it says create a static pod named static busybox. On the control plane node, it uses the busybox image and the command sleep 1000. So what we have to actually do here is let's go down to where we have about information about static pods. So the first thing I would probably do here is just get the actual, as the note sort of says, verify the location of the actual static pods. So probably I would change to that folder, and I would grep this file looking for static pod. And we can see that the static pod location is actually in etc Kubernetes manifest. So that's the standard of where static pods are actually kept. But you could actually have a look at that kubelet config file for if you just kind of sort of say cat config.yaml, you can sort of see here's a static pod that we basically just that location that we just kind of grep for. But you could actually have a look into this file as well and just make sure that you understand everything about it. But really what we want to do then is we want to actually kind of go to, let me just go to that location in for manifests, and let's create a static pod here and just make sure that we create that file. And if I sort of say cat static busybox, you can sort of see that. So it says create a static pod. So it's static pod busybox, uses the busybox image, which is here, and it uses the sleep, which is actually here. So that looks good. So let me just come back over here and let's sort of see. So we just kind of verified and cat that the file. And if we kind of go now into sort of say ls.lhr, so sort of see, you can actually sort of see there's an actual static busybox pod here. And if I do get pods now, you can actually sort of see that there's a static busybox control paid pod that's basically running 54 seconds. So as you know, with static pods, they also attach the name of the actual node that they're actually running on. So in this case, our node here was called static busybox, but it attached the control plane node onto it. That's basically running 54 seconds. So that looks good. So that looks to be question 7. So we can kind of move on then to question 8. Now, just actually before I actually move on to the kind of question 8, to actually complete it, let's kind of go back to our ChatGPT and sort of see, Kubernetes, Kubernetes static pods. So let's sort of see what the chat sort of says about static pods. So it says static pods are a way to create pods without the use of the Kubernetes API server. Instead, static pods are created and managed directly by the Kubernetes node by the kubelet, which is the primary node agent that runs on each node. So if somebody, was actually looking up kind of static pods for the first time, you know, this would have fantastic information about what an actual static pod is and what's the difference between, a static pod and a normal pod that would basically be created by using the API server. So, again, using this kind of information here as you're kind of working through the exams, maybe for the first or second time, certainly, definitely does help and reinforce the information that you're trying to learn. Because at the end of the day, I mean, these are mock exams, and really, you are trying to kind of complete them, and you are trying to complete them in the time that's required, because that's your kind of proof that you're nearly ready to schedule the exam. But you know it's not the worst thing in the world that the first time that you kind of take a little bit more kind of time on the actual questions, and the second time, then the third time, you start becoming faster and faster because you've already read about what the static pod does, just to kind of remind yourself. So just in case you'd completed the course and you couldn't remember what an actual static pod was, you can obviously sort of see that the chat definitely kind of provides us kind of great information here. So and it also kind of saves off this information, as we've sort of seen before. So let me just kind of go back into our mock exam here. So we were on question 7 there. So question 8, create a pod in the finance namespace named that with the image of that. So really, there's not a huge amount of actually there's not a huge amount of kind of information here. So we can sort of say, the first thing we can sort of say is here we can kind of get the we can kind of get the namespace. So say, well, the namespace does actually exist, and it's basically up to 2 minutes. But we can also sort of say we can create a pod using the imperative method. So run temp bus, which is the name of our pod, with that image, the namespace finance, try run it out. So the output is YAML into the pod YAML file here. And the only thing you may kind of do in the exam, it's just to kind of be kind of clear that maybe sort of you may kind of, change that to be like actually Q8 rather than pod. Because if you went back looking, when you've kind of completed a number of these and you went back looking at pod, you may not remember, well, what did pod represent? What question did it actually relate to? So probably, you could kind of just kind of call it something like Q8. And I think I kind of discussed this a little bit kind of in the previous one. I mean, you can do kind of, let's sort of say it was like, for example, static pod, finance, namespace, if that was kind of really what you were actually creating. But really, they're not testing you on that file name. They're testing you that you've actually created a static pod. So like kind of a Q8 or something like that, get your own kind of theory. But Q8, rather than typing out the full kind of temp bus, namespace, all of that. It's certainly it's certainly a kind of way to save some kind of time during the exam itself. So let me just sort of say Q8. So we've kind of done that, and let's sort of say we can actually V8. We can verify our kind of file if you're really going to want it to use. So you could sort of say Q8 YAML here, and you can sort of see the type, and then you can sort of just apply. Of course, I've just kind of updated my pod name to follow my own kind of practice here. And you can just sort of say, well, Q8 is now actually created. And then all you'd simply have to do is kind of in the finance namespaces, just make sure that you actually can see all of um, your temp bus pod that's actually running. Now, one thing I kind of notice here is obviously, I've kind of created it in the ECT Kubernetes manifests directory. Just make sure that you kind of go back to, the actual root of where you were actually working, because if you create any file that basically has a pod in here, um, it will actually create a static pod. But in this case, this is a kind of first run through on the actual mock exam. And really, we're just kind of trying to understand and learn about the question. So I'm not kind of too concerned about it, but it would be just something to kind of pay attention for, kind of in the future, to make sure that if you've created in a pod file in the manifest file, but then it's going to become a static pod, right? So just kind of make sure that you're always kind of in the correct directory. But especially when you're taking the exam, you'll basically be told, the context that you need to be in. Maybe you're told to kind of go to a certain folder. Make sure that you're kind of following the instructions here. Here it's quite kind of easy and kind of simple, just to kind of make sure that you follow the correct directions here. So now we're sort of saying, question 9 here, it sort of says, a new application, Orange has been deployed, there's something wrong with it, and identify and fix this issue. Now, this is a weight of 8, and we're probably, 8 questions in so far, and we've probably got about 30 minutes to go. Now, you know, in reality, there's kind of a few different kind of things that I would kind of do on the second run. Like definitely, I wouldn't be typing in kubectl, for example. I wouldn't be copying from the actual notes here. I wouldn't be kind of copying, because you won't have notes in the actual exam here. So, try and time yourself, as if you actually have to type these in. I'm just kind of copying these in because, for the actual sake of the recording. I mean, nobody wants to really sort of see somebody typing in something for, taking kind of too long. But in reality, if I was kind of doing this in the kind of mock exams myself, I'd start to kind of actually to kind of be typing these type of kind of commands in, just to get kind of practice, and then I'd be using aliases and a few kind of things like that, which we'll kind of cover in one of the actual sessions closer to the exam. But right now, what we're sort of saying is, if we kind of clear the screen, but right now we're just sort of saying, new application Orange has been is deployed, there's something wrong, and fix it, right? So really what we want to do, is sort of say, let's kind of, describe our pod Orange here. And you can sort of see, you can basically sort of see that if you kind of go up here, there's a command here that sort of says the app is running, and sleep for that. And it basically sort of says it's in a waiting state. So it's not doing something that it should be doing, basically. And really what you're sort of saying is, like, the new application Orange is deployed, there's something wrong with it. So it does tell you, that the application itself, actually has something wrong. So if you sort of say, let's sort of just put an alias, going back to our own kind of convention here, kubectl. If I sort of say get deploy, with no deployment here, so if I sort of say get pods, you can actually sort of see that the orange pod here has an actual problem, and it kind of went into a crash loop back off. So basically, it kind of crashed at the end container here. So it was kind of trying to start off, and then it basically kind of crashed. And basically, what you're sort of seeing and noticing here is that there was actually, like, at the moment, kind of 4 restarts, and the time is kind of in 2 minutes. So kind of every 30 seconds, the actual pod is getting restarted. So there's something seriously wrong with that that itself, like that actual pod itself. So really kind of what, it's trying to sort of see if you could actually um, test and kind of troubleshoot, a kind of a running pod here, that's basically crashing. So you can sort of see if you look at the actual logs, for the init service. So there's a pod here, so you can actually kind of describe your pod. You can go in, you could find your let me kind of just do that here quickly. So you can just take your describe pod orange here, and you could kind of go in here, and you could actually sort of see that there's actually two containers here. So there's an orange container here, and there's an init my service container. So this is kind of one container here, and then this is the second container here. And really what's sort of happening here is that, this one here went into a crash loop back off state, because it looks like, if you kind of come down to the kind of command here, you can sort of see, this does not look right. So sleep, so, with multiple kind of E's is not actually correct here. So all really they're looking to make you understand about is kind of, in the containers, how they're basically, running together. But, one is crashing here, so it's having an effect on the other one from starting. So, this one is basically crashing. So what we'd actually have to do here is like just check the actual logs on the actual in a container that's basically, running here. Here I sort of say, get the pod orange and save it off here. So again, this kind of, we're on question 9 here. So I'm going to actually just change this now to be kind of question 9 rather than just sort of calling it pod. And here, you can now kind of delete your orange pod because you've basically saved it off. Because what we want to do is we want to fix it. We actually want to kind of fix that issue. So the next thing I want to do is just kind of go back in here, and I'm also going to call this Q9 instead. And I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to go down to my inner container, and I'm basically just going to update that. So I'm just going to take a little note here to sort of say on the orange it should be Q9. And I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to just remove those extra kind of E's, and I'm going to save that. And then I'm going to come down here, and I'm actually going to just apply that. Because again, I'm kind of, I'm also kind of studying for the exam, so I'm also kind of using, these are my notes basically that I'm kind of, putting together to help me as much as possible to kind of learn about this environment. And you can also sort of see that now, the orange pod is actually up and running. So that kind of looks in a good and a healthy state now. And probably what I just kind of do here is just kind of come down here to my notes here. And I'm just going to sort of say, well, that actually probably would be better off to be called Q9. That would also be called Q9, and then I'd sort of also kind of call that Q9. And here I believe this was also kind of Q8, and this was also Q8, and this is also Q8. And it's just a way to kind of, mark the actual pods, mark the actual files of what you're basically using. So that I'll just kind of save, and I can just come back down here to my orange pods, and I can sort of see that everything is looking good. So I can now kind of continue on with my exam. Now, if you were to ask, Kubernetes, ChatGPT, how to troubleshoot pods, let's sort of see what it comes up. And so troubleshooting pods in Kubernetes typically involves identifying, diagnosing issues. Here's some general steps you can take. So, check the status of the pods. If it's in a pending state, it may be waiting for resources such as CPU to become available. Check pod events, describe your pod. Check your pod logs, which is what we also kind of did there. It's kind of just a nice kind of way to sort of say if ChatGPT has any other kind of suggestions of what you're kind of attempting to do on your mock exams. Now, obviously, you won't have ChatGPT, so really, during the exam, you're going to be depending on the whole documentation of Kubernetes, and this is where you're going to be living in this documentation. But the point is, right now, you're starting to kind of prepare for the exam. So um, right now, it's also a kind of still a bit of a learning experience. So when we kind of go to question 10, then we can also sort of see that we sort of says expose the app as a service on a port that on the nodes in the cluster, the web application listens on port 8080. So we basically have to expose the app as a service, and it gives you an extra service name. So in this case, just be kind of careful about, the application name plus the service name plus the port and plus the listening ports. It's giving you specific information that you should be basically using here, because you know if you were to call it something else, you would actually lose points for that. So there's honestly no points in actually, there's no point in losing kind of silly points over something that it specifically asks you to kind of name it this or name it that. So we can sort of say here, we can VI our service, and here it says add node port under the target port tag. So if I kind of go in here and I just come down to my target port, it's saying that I should be adding my node port, because we know that a node port doesn't get automatically added to these types of specs for a service. I can now save that off because I can actually sort of see it now. Again, in the exam, you're probably best to kind of verify, just doing a kind of simple cat to make sure that you saved off the file direction. That would make sure, but also just be conscious that there is also time. So it's a kind of balance between doing it quickly and verifying kind of quickly and making sure that everything is kind of working, rather than kind of spending too long kind of verifying information as well. And then you can sort of see that the actual service here has actually been created. Now, the next kind of question kind of comes back to like using a JSON path query. So it basically sort of says, using JSON path query to retrieve the OS image of all nodes, right? So if it's in theory, if I was to sort of say get nodes, you know, there's only one control node at the moment that is actually running. But in theory, imagine if this was a live environment and there was, 1,000 nodes here that are basically running together. This type of JSON path that we kind of covered previously in one of the sessions is kind of critically important to be able to query information inside of your cluster kind of quickly and get that information. So it also sort of says here, store it out to an output file, and that makes sense that you would be practicing this type of thing, because you know, you wouldn't want to be querying this type of information all the time. And once you get the query correct, you really would want to kind of save it off, because you could imagine that your boss, asked you to kind of, get all of the OS images that is part of the nodes and store it into that file, and email that file over to me. And it could be a PDF, it could be Excel, it could be anything. But the kind of practice here is just making sure that you can actually do that. Now, in here in the kind of in the notes here, I kind of have different kind of ways, kind of starting at the kind of the the root node, and then finding the actual status, and then of the status finding the node info, then from the node info finding the OS image. I'm not going to kind of run through all of those right now, because it would probably take too long for the recording. But the kind of point is that with JSON path, you can basically kind of query down to getting the minimal information that you basically want. So that's kind of something that we kind of covered in the last session. But really now, if I was to sort of say cat and copy that and remove my period, you can sort of see that I just have the actual OS image. So I know that this control plane node, which is the only one basically running in this cluster right now, it basically has Ubuntu 20. So just kind of have a look maybe back at kind of JSON path queries from from the session that we kind of covered, and make sure that you become really kind of good at the JSON kind of path queries, because it does seem to be something that could also help your day-to-day job really. But if I was to sort of say to chat, um, I can sort of say Kubernetes JSON path get OS image version. Maybe we can sort of say it like that. Let's sort of see, to get the OS of image, you can sort of say you can use the following expression. The expression will return the first image based on the container. To use expression, run the following command: deployment JSON path. And then yeah, so and then it's basically kind of, it's basically sort of saying, here's the JSON path, and here's how to actually find the actual image for the first node that you basically have running. But you kind of get the idea that you could kind of query and then kind of change it to be what you really kind of want it to be. So um, let me see if we can just then kind of go to now number 12. So next question is the last question really. And it says create a persistent volume given the volume specification. So, with persistent volumes, you're probably going to find that it's going to be a little bit, it's going to take a little bit longer, and that's probably why the weight has kind of gone up a little bit. But here it just sort of says create a persistent volume given the given specification. It doesn't actually say about, create the actual persistent volume claim right now. So, I would sort of say here, go and read up, obviously about the storage and persistent volume such as for host path. Um, but really, what you're looking to do is create a kind of persistent volume here. Let's just kind of clear the screen for a second. I'm going to create a persistent volume. Let's sort of put this information from YAML beside it, and you can sort of see, okay, so the API version, the kind of persistent volume. The name is that, so the name matches, the storage matches, the access mode, read write many matches, and the host path also matches. And make sure that in something like this that has a little bit more weight, double check those type of things, because you certainly don't want to kind of lose information, or you certainly don't want to lose kind of time or points over a silly kind of mistake. And make sure that the actual formatting is correct. And that's where you would maybe kind of spend a little bit more time, because you've kind of shaved time off of maybe more simpler questions, um, rather than you basically then have kind of a little more kind of time for something that's a little bit more kind of delicate. And this is just a kind of persistent volume. But if you also kind of search into persistent volume, you can sort of see here persistent volumes, how you would create them. Now again, like we sort of said in the previous tasks, is do not be reading this for the first time. Make sure that um, you've read this a few times. You know exactly where to kind of go and find the specific information that you're basically looking for. um, because it's the exam is not for kind of reading through this. The exam is simply for um, because you do have access to this kind of documentation. You certainly don't want to be kind of trying to find information like that at kind of during the exam time itself. So just make sure that you've kind of read through, and you've kind of found the actual information that you kind of require beforehand. But let's kind of go back, and let's kind of let's just create our persistent volume here. So what the first thing I need to do is obviously save that, and I just want to kind of create it. You can sort of see that I can sort of see, well, let's see if we have so we basically have our persistent volume, and it says its status is available. Now there's nothing bound to it, there's nothing at the moment for the claims that's basically bound to this. But basically, because the question here sort of says create persistent volume, and that's all it does. So actually sort of say, so this in theory um, make sure that you satisfy these requirements. So obviously kind of going back to our GPT as well, we can sort of say Kubernetes persistent volumes, you know, and I know I kind of had it here, from the kind of the previous one, but you can sort of say if you did kind of type in that, the information that you basically get back and read through it, make sure that you kind of understand it. Because again, it's not that you would actually have access to this, but you will kind of learn something from this and just then kind of, um, relate it back to your actual your kind of Kubernetes documentation about kind of persistent volumes and that type of thing, because it will certainly help. And then you can sort of say, just to kind of finish this off, you can sort of say, you can just kind of describe it, and you can sort of see, here's the retain policy, the access modes, and like we said before, like the access modes for claims and persistent volumes also have to match. And then it also says it's a type of host path, and trying to find out, what an actual host path is and why it's an important concept within Kubernetes. But that type of thing basically says, okay, well, right now what we've done is we've kind of moved through the 12 questions, and we still have a bit of time. And when you're in the actual exam scenario, and you do actually have a bit of time, make sure that any kind of questions that kind of came up, that were maybe you're a little bit kind of unsure about, or maybe you had to kind of think twice about, just use the time to try and go back and try and do the best that you actually can on the exam itself. But what I'm going to do is right now, because it's a kind of first run through, I'm going to sort of say yes, I believe I've kind of created and satisfied the questions here. And even if you basically have something that kind of fails, um, this is the point of the mock exams, that you're kind of building up your speed. So now, um, you can see right now we don't actually have anything that kind of failed right now. But if there was something that kind of came back, just take the time to kind of go back and so say, well, okay, so question 9, I was a bit unsure about, and then on a kind of second run and third run, you'd be a lot more kind of confident about what you're actually trying to do. And that's where you're kind of really getting into kind of, that exam mode that you sort of, you've nearly kind of done these kind of types of questions 7 to 8 times kind of before you actually sit down for the exam itself. So I hope you enjoyed this one, and I will see you in the next. Thank you.